You look great. You're the first person I've interviewed that's in all white.
I've worn all white for over 7 years.
Oh, I love it.
That's all I own.
You look great.
Thank you.
You don't see many people wearing all white. I do it sometimes.
I just noticed that.
Yeah. No, you look great. So how many times have you seen the Grateful Dead?
101 times.
101.
Yes.
This was what age were you doing it?
15 was my first show. It was at Alpine Valley in 1984, and I think it's been 6 countries. My brother bought me a ticket for my birthday to AC/DC, and so a couple years later, there was all these advertisements on the radio for Grateful Dead, and I just thought it was a heavy metal band. And so I went to the show with a 15-year-old friend, took a bus out there, and it was just like this parking lot scene with hippies and people selling peanut butter and honey, banana sandwiches, and like just bands in the parking lot, and just this scene of like love and hippies, and you just felt this energy that you just...
What year was this?
1984. And then at that show, we paid for the bus tickets, and then when we took this bus out with a bunch of other people, you're supposed to change the bus ticket with the driver for the ticket into the show. So the show's about to start. We get there 5 hours early. We're meandering through the line, Alpine Valley, this massive venue in...
Did you look like a deadhead then?
Wisconsin. I look like a deadhead. No, I didn't know what a deadhead was. I had normal hair. I mean, I was 15, so it was 8.
So you became a deadhead after this?
Became a deadhead after that.
Oh, I see.
But there's an interesting scenario. When we got to the front gates, we had these tickets that were bus tickets. I mean, we were so naive and green, and they looked at us like we were insane, and there's like 10,000 people behind us, and they took pity on us though, and they walked us in backstage, they sat us in front, and it was just this music that made you want to dance. And a guy next to me had some mushrooms. We took a couple. It wasn't a very intense trip, but it was just this amazing place. And then after that, I fell in love with the scene of the love and the music. And that's a whole nother story. And the Grateful Dead had a 600-song repertoire. So they would do a spring, summer, winter, fall tour. You could go see 15 shows. You might see 4 songs repeated. They had 2 drummers, and they'd always have a drum solo in the middle. So it was never the same show. And then like the next year they came back for 3 days. I went to all 3 days. And then we also followed them to Chicago. And then 17 when I was 18. So 84, 85, 86, 87... 88, and then in 89, and by then I probably had already saw 20 shows. I went to Canada to see them one time, New York City, and but then I just took off with them. Met this girl in high school. We dated for 4 years. We were going to get married, and the white picket fence and everything. I had a full-time job. I bought a brand new car, and I was just like, I'll do this with you, but I have to just go see the Dead. Come with me. And so she said no, and I left, and I went on tour with the Grateful Dead. And after that, it was 89, 90, 91, 92 until 92. 91 and 92, I really wasn't on tour. And in like 1990, I really ceased with all LSD sales because the fear of going back to prison.
But you eventually turned into a deadhead, looked the part.
I did look the part. Probably in school, there was like the jocks and the greasers.
You had hair down your back.
And the dirt balls. So then that's what we called them. But I was a jock when I went in, and I was varsity wrestler. I played a little football, but then I became a dirtball, so to speak. But I had long hair, but not like once I went on tour. But there was a safety first on tour too, like selling drugs. And there was always a safety first in my whole life of selling drugs. Even when like in high school, we grew pot, my friends all grew pot. And I remember the first time I came home with a quarter pound, which was right around the time of that first Dead show. And my mom said something like, you stink like a skunk. And so right away, the fear, and then this is the dichotomy of it, because you're doing something that your parents don't want you to do. It's illegal, but it's not like I was, waking up, smoking pot, stealing money to get it. It was more of a recreational thing, and I really wasn't harming anyone, but it was highly freaking illegal. Like people today don't understand of what we went through. And today you can just get it anywhere. But like even on Dead Tour, when we were driving through like the state of Texas, everybody put everything away. It was hidden, no tie-dyes. Your hair was back and like for the next 15 hours, because in Texas in the 80s, if you got pulled over with a couple joints, you were going to prison. I mean, it was a felony. So after that happened with my mother, I'd started hiding it outside. And anytime anybody wanted to buy it, there would be places, we lived right by a park, and I would go dig it up. But I'd never have been caught with drugs in my life ever. There was one time at a Grateful Dead show, 89-90 New Year's in Oakland or San Francisco, wherever they did the New Year's Eve show. And I was walking to my hotel room. It was a Motel 6, and it was notorious with the Oakland police. Supposedly they owned it. And I had about 3/4 of an ounce on me with about $700. And they just grabbed me like this and threw me in the car. And they said, we're going to bust you unless you tell on your friends. They didn't know anything who I was or whatever. It was New Year's Eve. There was 10,000 hippies everywhere, and they grabbed the ounce. They said it was an ounce. It was 3/4 of an ounce. Anyway, I spent the next 6 days in jail, arraignment, because it was during the weekend. So like they didn't have it on the Friday, and then it was whenever the New Year's fell, and it was just this fiasco. It was my first taste of jail. But when I went in front of the judge, the arraignment judge, he threw it out. They even gave me all my money back, the exact bills. They had saved it in evidence because the cops like, this is over an ounce, and if it's over an ounce, it's a felony. So it was just, so I guess in that sense, they caught me, but they just essentially, there was no reason for them to grab me. So that was a bad experience. But the safety first was the paramount thing of my whole life, selling heroin in prison or selling the marijuana. And in prison, I sold heroin just to support my marijuana habit. And that's just something that we could get into that if you want to. But that is...
You went to prison for drugs?
Selling LSD, yes. I had 9 counts of interstate commerce for LSD and 9 counts of money laundering. And the way the statute is written for the money laundering, I think it's 1856, but it's a statute about that thick. So money laundering is, besides what you think of, like we're going to hide all the money in gold or we're going to buy real estate. If I send you money from an illegal transaction and say I use the mail or I wire it to you, any sort of transferring of money, that falls under the money laundering statute. So it's a very broad application of the law. And then when they arrested me, they already had an 18-count federal indictment that they had convened a grand jury for 9 months before. And then they were following me around the country trying to catch me with LSD. Because then they know they've got you. And then the whole game was, if they get you, they can get you to tell, and then they get the bigger fish. And the thing is with LSD, for us, like LSD was a sacrament. It was a spiritual experience. It was something that I never abused. I never knew anyone who abused it. If you take like a quartz crystal, it looks like a gram. Like a gram of LSD looks like just like a quartz crystal would look like. Same size as a gram of cocaine, but it's 10,000 hits. And there's very few people in the world that have ever seen crystal LSD. I mean, these people, we had a conspiracy to want to bring about radical social change. And that's really, when you think of LSD, Albert Hofmann discovered it in 1938. And then he first took it in April 19th of 1943. And then MK Ultra, the CIA got a hold of it in the 1950s. They did a lot of studies with alcoholism. Bill Wilson, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, did a lot of research with it with the psychologist Cohen here at the LAVA. But they were doing that all over the country. But what they realized is that it kind of made people, the cultural imprinting, the neural imprinting that we have as a culture to live a certain way, the farming society, the work, like it sort of stripped that all away. And it didn't make you lazy or like, you know, you're addicted to heroin or fentanyl or something like that, but it was more, you just really saw the world for what it was. And So that's sort of like some of the history of where LSD came from. But when I was younger, I was always afraid that LSD was going to make me insane. And so I did mushrooms a couple times. And then when I would go to the shows, and I was a small time guy. I never had more than $6,000 or $7,000 ever in my life of selling drugs. And if I could get 2,000 or 3,000 in between shows, that would get me to a whole summer tour. I mean, this was the 80s. If you're with 2 or 3 guys, we each got a couple grand, it would get you to the next show. And then like at the shows, you could always sell grilled cheese and beer. If you went like down to like $300 or $400, and then in 2 shows, you'd have a couple $1,000s. And then the really good people that were making the LSD, if they thought you were addicted to alcohol or you did heroin or cocaine ever, you would not be able to buy LSD from them. And there's very few labs in the history of LSD that have ever been busted. I mean, it's a very clandestine thing. You cannot make it in a bathtub. You need about $30,000, $40,000 worth of glassware, maybe 5 days, and you'll end up with 4 or 5 million hits. But these people did not drive expensive cars. They didn't have bling bling. They really wanted to bring about radical social change. And so I don't know if you've ever heard of Bear, Augustus Owsley III. He was the original sound man for the Dead. He came up with the Steal Your Face, which is that skull with the 13-point lightning bolt. He made exceptionally good LSD. The Purple Barrel's Owsley. He died about 10 years ago, but essentially like the electric Kool-Aid acid test with Ken Kesey. He was part of the MK Ultra unbeknownst to him, and then one day he stole 500 hits out of the cabinet, and then he went on with the Merry Pranksters, the Bus Further, FURTHUR, and then they took it all around the country. That bus is actually in the Smithsonian today in New York City. I don't know if you know the history of all that. You probably do, though, because you're from California.
No, I don't. I'm from Chicago.
Or are you from Chicago? That's right, anyway. Well, you're in California.
I'm
We're in
California.
California. I'm sorry.
So you were doing this for how long? Selling LSD and touring with the Dead?
So, So 84, I had taken mushrooms and I had smoked marijuana. But then in 85, that's when I bought my first sheet of LSD. Now, on occasion, mushrooms would come into town in Milwaukee, and maybe I'd get a quarter pound, and you'd make $600-800 off of it. But the first sheet of LSD that I ever bought was the very next year. I was 16. I drove, and so that was 1985. And I would buy one sheet of LSD from someone that I didn't really know. I never sold drugs at a parking lot in the Grateful Dead. Never, ever. That was like the cardinal sin. You would never do that. You might meet someone and plan to meet him in 2 or 3 weeks in a city, but never, ever did I taint the scene of Grateful Dead with that. But I did score. And so I took that sheet back to high school, and I think I sold each hit for like $8 or $9, but like 2 people bought the whole thing. So for what I paid $30 for, I probably got back $600 or $700. Now I did that 4 or 5 times over the next 84, 85, 86, 87, 88. And then maybe by 88, I'd find someone I'd buy like 8 sheets, which is 800 hits. And then, but I never was like selling single hits. Like people would just say, I'll give you $1,000 when I came back to Milwaukee. So like that would be 240 to 1,000. But when I told you about the girl, we were going to get married. And then I went on tour. So that was the fall of 1989. And I still had not taken LSD at this point. I'd get to the first LSD trip. And so I went on, it started in Brendan Byrne. And it was October 13, 14, 15, 16, I believe, 17. There were 4 or 5 shows. And it happened to fall on October 15th, 1989, which was the year anniversary of my father dying. Died right in my arms the year before, but I didn't remember that. And because my friends, they grew really good marijuana, I brought a pound with me on tour. And then I met some people who I'm still friends with today who knew some people that they were with. And because I had this really good marijuana, that was my in. And they just sort of looked through my soul. And then I got the connection to, we'll just say Rainbow. but they were chemists and they loved the weed. So I'm at the show. Do you want me to tell you about the first time?
Sure.
And with this beautiful woman, and I decided, okay, I've taken mushrooms. I don't think LSD is going to make me go crazy. I've done this research, looked at it, and it's like, I want to try it one time. You know, the fear of, because of the stuff that the culture told you over the years about you're going to jump out a window and all the BS. And so we were in the show before it started, way early, and she gave me one and she took one, and then we're like, 10 minutes later she gave me one, she took one. I can't believe I'm saying this on camera. Anyway, she had a whole sheet, and she's friends with the people that I met, and we kind of became this one little sub-family of the big family. And so I don't know, maybe pretty soon there's like 20 hits off this sheet. She took 8 or 9 and 10, and and then all of a sudden, the lights were just getting a little weird. But it was this beautiful trip. So like, we saw the show, but we realized, like, cause we kept, saying she had never taken it either. Maybe once before she did. And, it was a beautiful trip. The lights kind of kept getting dimmer and slower. And, but what LSD does is it breaks you down to the moment, to the vibrations and the colors. You see sounds, you hear colors, and then today, within the last 25 years, if you talk to like a nanoscientist, and they can actually, everything is a wave, and everything has a color, and they can look at it with cameras, and then they can also listen to like a leaf and what it emits. And so it sort of just brings you down to a place that is, I mean, I can't explain it with words, but it's not something that, we weren't drunk, we weren't high. It wasn't like, it was very well thought out, because the 15th was the third show. So I had met them the second I came to the parking lot. So this is like the third day we're hanging out. And then I realized this was a year ago to the day that my dad died. And I had a moment. And I'll tell you about my parents. I was born in Chicago. My parents met at Playboy. My mom posed for Centerfold in the 1960s. Pompeo Posar just hounded the crap out of her, and she finally relented. My dad collected money. They told me about parties at like the mansion on State Parkway. But during that trip, and I want to share this memory with you, when I was 5 years old, my dad took me to a Chicago Blackhawks game at the Chicago Stadium. It was in October of '74, so I was like 5.5, and they won 10-4. And I remember when they scored the first goal, and I was standing on the ground, and the whole stadium shook, and it was like there was an earthquake. And I just remember grabbing onto his legs, and then he picked me up above the crowd, and then the sound, like that is imbued in my spirit, like the memory of that game. And then I remember my brother took me to a game down there when Jordan was playing, or someone, but it was after they wrecked it, and it's gone. But have you ever been there when it was the Chicago Stadium?
Many times, yeah.
It was amazing. So, but that was my first LSD trip. And then after that is when I met the people, and they were very careful about who they sold it to and the safety first, and then basically training me. And then like the way that we transferred the money was a very sophisticated way, and we would send the LSD overnight. You would wire the money through Western Union, and you would use a fictitious name and a physical description and like a code question. Now, you can't do that anymore. I'm not giving away any secrets for anybody. It's got to be an ID. And so even back then, there were times where I remember one time at the San Francisco Jerry Garcia shows, there was a Western Union open till like 2 a.m. And I went in there and I filled out 3 pieces of paper. I'd sent, I think, 1,000, 1,000, and 1,500 hits. It was roughly $4,500. It's 3 different slips of paper, 3 different, same physical description, and then 3 different test questions. And like, I got the money. And then the people that I always sent the LSD to, like whenever I did the overnight envelope, like I never touched anything with my hands. I wrote with my left hand. Like there was no trace of anything. And like, so, and then they would always, they told me like, if any heat ever comes down, you know, like, and you had to throw something away, like safety first, don't worry about it. And they would have fronted me as much as I wanted, but I never thought really big like that. But I always had this incredible fear of going to prison. And so there was this constant juxtaposition of what do I believe in, but am I willing to risk my freedom for it? And like on a dead tour, literally, if you had 4,000 or 5,000, you were rich because you could maintain 3,000 or 4,000 just by selling some grilled cheese. You're not really... You got a Coleman stove and you go to the local grocery store and you're just getting to the next show. But the Grateful Dead, I mean, for lack of a better word, it was like a church. And like when I was there, it everything stopped. Like you were in the moment. It was this beautiful scene. There was very little drama. It was just a really kind and gentle place. And I was kind of a troubled kid growing up. So I didn't really know which end is up. I still probably don't, but I know a little bit more than what I did. And it was something that I loved to do. But deep down in my heart, I knew that LSD was not bad. I knew it was illegal and the government looked at it that way. And the penalties for it were absolutely unbelievable. I mean, the drug laws, the way that they happened in the 80s, were so intense and so barbaric. I mean, people were getting 30, 40 years for growing marijuana. LSD, I had a level 34 in the sentencing guidelines with a two-point enhancement for leader, organizer, 2-point enhancement for continuing career criminal, and then one other 2-point enhancement. But after trial, he did away with the 3. And then I had a level 34, and I think it goes up to 40 or 42. And then he said 151 months. He gave me the bottom of the guidelines, which right away I knew it was 12 years, 7 months. I jumped for joy.
How did you get caught?
And so I got caught. I was guilty. I did what they said I did, but I wasn't really caught. So I don't know if you know how the justice system works, but a lot of times people get arrested and they might be in possession of something. And so then they may convene a grand jury or you might plead guilty. And one of the things that saved me in jail was the fact that I took my case to trial, which I didn't understand the ramifications of that, but it garnered respect in every prison I went to, because basically 95-ish% of the people in federal prison under the drug laws plead guilty, because if you don't, you've got a 99% chance of losing. And so how did I get caught? So they convened a grand jury. I got indicted, but I didn't know, and they started following me around the country. And then I was going to work for my brother, declared that I wasn't going to sell drugs. He had a big landscaping company. He's like, work with me for a year and I'll give you half. And I was getting ready to go to work. And I thought Jesse was there to pick me up. And it was the DEA. And they said, are you Joel Blaeser? I said, yes. They threw me down to the ground, guns drawn, trigger cocked. There's 2 guys out front with shotguns, 2 guys in back. And he had the indictment and he threw it in my lap. He's like, you're facing 40 years. He's like, it's 20 years a count. He's like, it's at least 40 years. They took me to jail. I had to do an arraignment, this whole ordeal. I had to go through the whole federal prison system before I got back to Kentucky. And then I was bailed out. But they had evidence from a gentleman. It's the only person I don't name by name in the book. As one of my customers, I'll just say on the East Coast. And he and I did business maybe a dozen times, and I sent him maybe 10, 12,000. He'd buy 1,000 hits at a time. And when they arrested him, remember the scenario I told you about the wiring and the fictitious and the fake, all that? His friend I sent him 1,000 hits. He sold his friend 25 hits, and that guy got in trouble. And then he told on Marty. And it all came out at trial, but the sheriffs just went to Marty's house just to say, this guy said, you sold us the LSD. And he broke down right on the front steps. And then he told the sheriffs the story about how he gets this overnighted to him, and then he burns the envelope, and he goes to the Western Union, and then they said, we're going to have you committed for surveillance or something, because they thought he was like mentally, there was something wrong with him. But the DEA got wind of it, and they came to the mental hospital because there was nothing wrong with him. And he told that to the DEA, and then the DEA said, you just admitted to a federal crime. You're going to get 15 years unless you help us get him. So he made a lot of calls, and but anytime I talked on the phone, I would just say, they're like, look, we're going to the show on the 27th. I want to get 21st row seats, because at that time in the 80s, Grateful Dead was the #1 grossing band. If you look at the records, 87, 88, 89, 90, 30, 40, 50 million, they were a top grossing act. And so it wasn't like I was making millions of phone calls, but they had a couple phone calls where he was asking for front row Grateful Dead tickets, 10 or 12. Never, ever a mention of drugs. I mean, my lawyer was amazing, Gatewood Galbraith. It was like a Perry Mason situation, but the jury found me guilty. And then I want to go back to my dad and the honor. So I got bailed out. I don't care who you are when you're facing 40 years. It's gonna test your fucking mettle, excuse my language. But whoever you are, like 40 years is a tough hallway. I was 23 years old, and and my family, they loved me, but they're like, look, you have to cooperate. You've got to do something. You can't go to prison. And I just remember one day shaving, and I looked at myself in the mirror. And anybody that says they're not going to consider it is a liar. But nothing was said at all when I was arrested. No statements were made. But when I was shaving, I'm like, I cannot be a rat because of me. I mean, the people that I dealt with were beautiful, but they would have never killed me. There would have been no threat. They probably would have paid me money if they could have done an actual LSD lab bust. But I'm like, I cannot do that. I am not that person. So I said, I'm going to try to win this trial. And I went to trial. And I just knew it was sort of a rite of passage. And I expected to get 20 years. But I remember my dad, honor. I remember in high school sometimes everybody would get in trouble. Something would happen, and then everybody would tell on themselves, and I wouldn't. And then the principal would get mad, but I wouldn't get suspended. They'd send me home, and my dad, I didn't lie, but it was always about, like, stand up for yourself and honor and never tell. Like, that was the thing. He fought in the war, and he was a very honorable man, and I saw him do things that were along those lines. And so I don't know if that affected me. I mean, obviously, in prison, I did some shenanigans, which was not cool. But since getting out 26 years ago, I've been, I'm a square. I pay taxes. I do what I do. And so that's cool. But I could not do what he did to me. But I was fucking scared, man. It's prison. Like, all the stuff that you think can happen can happen.
What prison were you in?
So I started out in Sandstone, Minnesota, which was a low, and I had 151 months. And I mean, how much do you want me to get into it?
Well, I mean, you ended up in Marion.
I ended up in Marion.
Tell me about Marion.
Marion there's a story behind Marion that I learned in the first prison, but essentially Marion opened after Alcatraz closed, United States Penitentiary, Marion, in 1963. And so most of the prison had normal movement, but it was still the highest security prison. And then there was one unit called H Unit that was 23-hour lockdown. And that was a model that was a supermax section of a prison, which no other prison in the world had. But essentially, there were Clayton Fontaine and Tommy Silverstein were in that prison. And on the same day, and in that part of the prison H Unit, when you came out of your cell, you had to be handcuffed and shackled, and 2 guards were next to you. One of them broke away to another cell. They unlocked his cuffs, and he killed a guard and horribly maimed 2 others. And then simultaneously the same time, Clayton Fontaine killed a guard. That was in 80. 1 or 2. And then after that happened, they declared Marion, they made the whole entire prison of Marion the supermax prison that was known up until maybe 2005. So the whole entire prison was locked down, single cells. You can never be next to a guard unless you're handcuffed behind your back, shackled, and there's 3 of them. So that was what they called the Marion model, and that was the new supermax ever, the whole entire prison. So there were riots in Talladega over the crack law. Now, while I was in prison, Clinton made all these incredible laws, this whole aura of the drugs, and you lock them up and everybody's getting 10, 20, 30 years. They changed, the LSD was 10,000 to 1 sentencing, and they changed the LSD law because they were weighing the carrier medium. So a gram, which is 10,000 hits, they would weigh 1 sheet, which might weigh 3 grams, or a sugar cube. So there was this disparity. And then with the L and M methamphetamine law and the marijuana law, if you had 50 cuttings of marijuana, right, and say they came in and found the 50 cuttings, they would say each cutting was like an ounce. But if you had 51 cuttings, this is the federal law at the time. If you had 51 cuttings, just one more, they would count each one as a kilogram, which is 2 pounds. So now that's 100 pounds. So the Sentencing Commission changed all 3 of those interpretations as a result of all this pressure. But those all predominantly affected white males, mostly. Over 90% on each of them. And the L&M methamphetamine law is like when you would get that stuff, the ephedrine for what people were doing, like they were buying those pills and crushing them, and they were selling that as meth, but it really wasn't. But when they would test it, it was so close, the feds didn't say, well, it's not real meth. So that was how they changed that. And then the crack law came up for the vote, and they changed it. The Sentencing Commission voted, and Congress overrode it. And then that was the day of the Million Man March, which if you look up that day, October 15th, 1995. That day, and that's a pivotal moment in my life, and that day, that prison, we took it over. A housing unit was burnt down to the ground like anything you've seen in a Hollywood movie. Half of the law library and where the rec area was burnt down. And then we were surrounded by tanks and like armored vehicles, and there was a helicopter above. But simultaneously, 12 other federal prisons simultaneously rioted. Now at that prison, they took 22 black guys and me, 1 white guy, and they sent us to Marion. And they said because somehow they charged us with a shot, which is a charge in jail, a 101, and a 100 is murder, 101 is riot. It's very dangerous, and half the guys that got sent to Marion with me got an extra 7 to 10 years added on their sentence. And so as a result of the riot, but what happened at that prison, there was something that happened with me with this is some juicy stuff. There was a duffel bag I had that someone made for me 3 prisons before, James Irving. He was in prison for LSD too. And so when you have property in prison, you have like a property slip. And then because every store doesn't sell the same thing. So when you get transferred, you would have your property slip. So I had this duffel bag in Florence. I had it in Pekin, and then I had it in there's a federal prison in downtown Denver. And then I went there. And so on the yard one day, this big, huge lieutenant, like when I came into the prison, he said, "You're not supposed to have that." He's like, "I know you faked this property slip and blah, blah, blah." He's like, "This looks like it was made out of a blanket." So one day on the yard, in front of everybody, he said, "I want that bag, you hippie rat." And he threw me to the ground from nowhere. And he grabbed the bag, and I grabbed it back, and I called him. I called him a name, a bad name, a real bad name. I just reacted. And the whole yard saw it. And he just elbowed me one in the face, and then you hit the deuces, right? And then everybody comes running. They threw me in the hole for about 6 or 7 weeks. They took the bag. Then, you can't react back to a guard ever. And I grabbed it like I just reacted because this guy made it for me, another deadhead that I met in jail. So anyway, that passes. That all passes over, but I started filing these complaints with the prison system, but then I stopped. But one day, he told me, he's like, if you continue to file these, he's like, I will send you to Marion. And I laughed at him because it's like you could stab a prison guard and not get sent to Marion. It's almost like it could see what was happening. But there was always a sense of camaraderie on the yard. And I want to digress for 1 second. When I was in Florence, Colorado, that was controlled more by the whites than the blacks. But it didn't matter whites or blacks. But one day in the chow hall, there was always a white and a black line, which as a deadhead never made sense to me, because it was like divide and conquer, right? The Indian came in and he had way too much to drink. And he took his cup and he went at a CO, a corrections officer. Now in the chow hall, if you ever do anything bad, you get in really big trouble because there's 400 or 600 guys. There's only 15 or 20 guards. They're vulnerable. And I witnessed this. And so the guards started literally just about beating him to death. And then the 2 guys from the white side and 2 guys from the black side stood up and they pointed and they're like, okay, you send him in, you send him in. And so in this midst of this place, this prison, this pit of bad and evil, everybody's doing time, the solidarity of we're going to send a white guy in and send a black guy in to help the Indian. And then they started beating those 2 guys, but they let up on the Indian and they told everybody to get down and then they took him away. And so it seems crude, but if you see the love in that these 2 factions of people of different races, but I saw many examples of that. And it's not like it's made out in Hollywood and in a Grateful Dead parking lot, the love and the sharing and the kindness. And so anyway, so now Marion. So we're on the bus, we're driving and they're not telling us where we're going. And everybody's trying to guess where they're going. And all of a sudden this thing of horror comes over me. This is after the place is burnt down. This is after everybody's charged. I said, holy shit, we're going to Marion. And everybody looked at me. They're like, there was silence. You could hear a pin drop. And there was this big mirror on the prison bus. And the guy looks up like this and he just smirks. When we got to Marion, it's a long ride. There was a regiment of the Ninja Turtles. They're dressed with everything. The shock plates, the things, the big, looks like, Skywalker. And they're lined up 14 deep and 10 wide, and the guy's got a camera. Now, I was only on Talladega Yard for maybe 5 or 6 months. In 2 or 3 months, I was in the hole because of the duffel bag incident. We got off the bus. They beat up everybody but maybe 3 people and me. Beat them in front of everybody, one at a time, right? To the bad. Beat them bad. And they planned this whole entire thing out from the beginning. And so then they check you in, they bring you in, you see a doctor. Just like anytime you go to a prison, you see a doctor, you see the counselor. Do you have any diseases? You fill out all the paperwork, you change your clothes, you shower. So then we're all in a holding cell. This is maybe 3 hours later. The guys that got the brutalest beatings are bandaged up. I mean, I'm telling this story. If someone told me this story, I don't even think I'd believe it. And so now once you're in Marion, it's a supermax prison. So you cannot be next to a guard without being handcuffed and shackled. And the whole check-in process and all that, the way it's set up, you don't. So we're in the holding cell. And if you can imagine a big rectangular room, and then in the corner of the room, there's a little tiny box. And so you go into that box, you get handcuffed and shackled. But outside of the box, they're reaching in, and then they take you to your cell. But what they do is they say, Blaeser, come on, you cuffing up first. And there's 3 guys they didn't touch. They were big, and they didn't know me. And so they cuff me and handcuff me behind my back, and then they open up the door to go back in the cage. And I'm pretty naive, and I just thought, oh, okay. And I go back into the cage and I'm like, oh my God, I'm in here, right? And then all of a sudden, the biggest dude in the cell, he starts bitching at the guard, motherfucker, we're not going to touch him, man. It's us against you. And like, they started like all as one, like, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. And they left me in there for about 15 minutes. Then they started cuffing everybody up. But like, that was my introduction to Marion. But I'll also say this, when they brought me to my cell, I was fucking grateful that I had a cell with nobody in it. I mean, I was prison, but like, and they had bars, so it was a little bit of easier time. So, but does that answer your question about Marion?
Yeah, I think it does. And so you got out, and what have you done since you got out?
I got out on September 7th, 1997. Yeah, it's because I filed 4 appeals. One went to the Supreme Court. One went to the appellate court. I got action on 2. I lost 2. The one that went to the Supreme Court was held in abeyance. So if there's an appeal that has a like kind issue exactly, you can attach yours, and the court will say, before they make the decision, they'll make a decision on, we're going to hold yours in abeyance, which means essentially it's the same thing. And so I got 90 months, reduced 20, and then 50. So I served 61 months. And then when I got out, I'll tell you a story. I got out, and I worked at the Bradley Center, which is now the Fiserv Forum. They wrecked it, but, doing catering. And then I got a job washing dishes. And then one day when I was going to work, the house across the street from me, I saw just as I was leaving, like DEA, FBI, like all these cars pulled up, and I'm like, oh my God. I'm like thinking, wait a second, I'm not doing anything. But they went to this house, and then I stood there, and then within maybe like 3 minutes, the guy comes out with a big, huge bag of cocaine. And I'm like, they're going to confiscate that house. Because in jail, it doesn't matter who you are. There's law libraries. There was a case, U.S. versus Bounds, which defined right to counsel. It was in the 70s. And right to counsel, if you're in prison, means law library. So the law libraries are pretty well stocked. And so even a dumb prisoner, you get to learn a lot about law. And I went down to the marshals the next day, and I said, I want to make an unsolicited bid on this house. I know you're going to confiscate it. And back then they had an arcane rule where if you came to them with an unsolicited bid, you got first dibs on the house. So 18 months later, I got that house, and I restored it and sold it. And that started I guess I'm an artist, and the last 20 something years, in 08, I hit a big bump and I had to start over.
Where do you live now?
I'm kind of just all over, but I'm staying in Milwaukee because I had some health tests done, but I'm looking to go somewhere else. I'm not sure. I was traveling all year. I sold my last house.
Looking back at your life, do you have regrets, or do you have things you wish you had done differently?
The regrets are things that I wish I'd done differently. Hindsight is always 20/20, looking through the rearview mirror. And the one thing that I don't know if I have regrets, but the one thing that I've learned is that to know my smartest attribute today could be knowing how dumb I am, and like, where is my circle of competence, and staying within that. And then a regret, that's a tough one. I remember my mother was very sick. I wear this in honor of my parents. This is their ring. And a couple days before she died, we were spending a lot of time with her, and we know that she was going to pass. And oh my God, this is going to be on here. But she wanted to stay with her that night. Now, she didn't die that night. But I think what I believe is she was ready to go, and she wanted to go that night, and she wanted me to be with her. And she held on for 3 more days, but we were with her. She was completely conscious. So that doesn't haunt me, but it really makes me think about, what is really valuable, and where am I in a rush to get to? Like the past and the future has never been and never will be. The only thing that's real is right here, right now. It's what matters. And in that moment, she wanted me to be with her. Now, had she died that night, I don't know if I would be here today, but she didn't. But so that is an almost regret, if that's one.
Mm-hmm. And Joel, what would you say is the most important lesson you've learned in your life?
The most important so far, or one that most is a big word, but absolutely to not have resentments. They're like poison. Like that is. Can I share another story about where I learned that?
Sure.
In Marion. I won't turn it into a big story, but there was a situation where I'd already told you about Tommy Silverstein, if that makes it in here. But one day I didn't get my rec, and I blurted some stuff out, and I used his name. And then they brought every prison guard in front of my cell. And then my mom came to visit me on New Year's Eve, and they just beat the shit out of me coming out of there. And it's the only time that anything physical ever happened to me in prison. But I kind of had it coming, and I garnered some more respect. And half the guys, 3/4 of the guys I got off the bus with got their asses whipped. But anyway, a couple months later, I was in the hole, and I realized that I had a very good shot at maybe winning my appeal and going home like soon. And I don't know how it came over me. I wasn't in AA. I wasn't religious. It had to be from the LSD and the hallucinogens. But these two cops came in the hole, and they just were like talking about having sex with their wives and trying to get us all hot and bothered. And when they left, me and Ghetto laughed at each other. But I had this incredible sense of empathy and sympathy for them. And then somehow something came to me. I'm just part of the whole. If anybody asks me what I am, I'm part of the whole. I don't restore houses. I want to be part of the whole. And I said, I have to pray for these people. I cannot leave here with resentments against these prison guards, or I'll have a life term of prison. That'll be a mental prison I will never get out of. And so don't get me wrong, I'm human. I'll get a resentment, and I got to pray for someone for 2 weeks. But that was my first lesson in this pit of wickedness. And I'm not somebody special, because everybody on that row, none of them got mad at the cops to varying degrees. So I'd say the biggest lesson, like that's a big one. That's a big lesson. And the other thing is, I am so sensitive to the world. I'm such a recluse and such a introvert. I really am. But that and I don't want to pat myself on the back, but I'm so glad I didn't tell. Like, I would have been fucked up, man. I probably would have OD'd and gotten addicted to fentanyl or coke or something really bad. I mean, I had my issues with coke, but is there anything else?
No, that's good. That's great. Joel, thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you, Mark.
You've had an interesting life.
How long was that?
48 minutes.
48 minutes. Wow.